In a bustling European city, where the streets were illuminated with bright lights and people hurried past each other, there was a beggar named Thomas. He was old, frail, and dressed in tattered clothes, hoping each day to find enough food to survive. One cold winter afternoon, Thomas sat on the sidewalk, shivering from the freezing wind. Passers-by looked at him with indifference, avoiding him as if he were an unnoticed part of the scenery. At that moment, a wealthy merchant named Edward happened to walk by. He was a successful man, owning vast properties, but he was always too busy with work to pay attention to anyone else. When he saw Thomas, he simply shook his head and walked on. But just a few steps later, he felt a strange chill pass through him, accompanied by an inexplicable feeling in his heart. That night, Edward couldn't sleep. The image of the frail beggar lingered in his mind. Then, in his dream, he found himself standing before a magnificent golden gate. A deep, gentle voice spoke. "You have everything in your hands, but are you truly rich?" Edward looked around but saw no one. The voice continued. "True wealth is not measured by possessions, but by the kindness in one's heart. Find what you have lost before it's too late." He woke up suddenly, his forehead damp with cold sweat. The next morning, Edward decided to return to the same street to find Thomas. When he arrived, he saw the beggar sitting there, looking even more haggard than the day before. Edward approached him, this time not with indifference, but with genuine concern. He sat down next to Thomas and asked, "Would you like a warm meal?" Thomas, surprised, nodded hesitantly. Edward took him to a nearby restaurant. As they ate, Thomas shared his story. He was once a hard-working carpenter, but after losing his wife and children to illness, he lost all hope and fell into poverty. Hearing this, Edward felt his heart sink. He realized that, between the two of them, Thomas may have once lived a more meaningful life than he had. After the meal, Edward decided to do something extraordinary. He took Thomas to his home, provided him with clean clothes, and offered him a warm place to stay. Then, he arranged for him to work at a carpentry workshop he owned. At first, Thomas couldn't believe in such kindness. But Edward simply smiled and said, "It is not I who help you, but God who has helped both of us." In the days that followed, Thomas's life changed completely. He was no longer a homeless beggar but a man who had rediscovered his purpose. Years passed, and Edward and Thomas became close friends. One day, Edward visited a priest at a local church and said, "I used to believe that wealth meant having more money. But now I understand that true wealth lies in compassion, forgiveness, and faith." The priest smiled and said, "You have found what God has always wanted you to see. Remember, kindness does not just save others, it saves your own soul as well." From that day on, Edward was no longer just a wealthy merchant, he became a man who brought hope to those around him. The message of the story. This story reminds us that true wealth is not measured by material possessions, but by kindness, forgiveness, and faith in God. As the Bible says, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy."